Thank you, Dan, for that gracious invitation and announcement, or invitation and welcome. My brother speaks very highly of you and your family and all the good people here in Fort Scott. I'm going to be a horrendous scandal here and give my talk off my computer. My only excuse is that it went through some revisions this morning, and this was the best way to do it. But I know, especially in light of what you're attempting to do at St. Martin's, that this is a terrible counterexample, so I'll mention it in my next confession. Listening to Patrick, the only thing I can say is, as a former Marine, because like Chris I am, is hoorah. This is something that I think is going to be a great project. With regard to the Marine Corps, everybody knows the first verse, I think. Here's from the halls of Montezuma. Yeah. Now, if we were a little later in the evening, after the cigars and the whiskey, I might sing the third verse for you. I'm not going to do that. I will just recite it. Here's health to you and to our Corps, which we are proud to serve. In many a strife, we fought for life and never lost our nerve. If the Army and the Navy ever look on heaven's scenes, they will find the streets are guarded by United States Marines. With all deference to my brothers who are here, who are served honorably in the other armed services, I am very proud of my younger brother, Chris. We are close in a number of ways. We're both Marine officers. We both went to Rice University. And there's another bond, supernaturally, that comes about really, I think, as an example of a felix culpa. Do you remember the felix culpa from the exalted, fruitful fault or happy fault of Adam? When I was 6 years old, I remember my mother asking me the question, would you like to be your brother's godfather? At 6 years old, I had no idea what that meant. I had not even made my first communion, let alone my confirmation. And I don't know who the priest was who permitted such an unusual and extra canonical thing to take place. I have since said to many parents, if you come to me and ask me, I have my 6-year-old son, I would like him to be godfather to my newly born baby, I'm going to say, please choose again. Because the Code of Canon Law doesn't permit that. But I'm grateful, whoever that priest was, because it has made a very special bond between my brother and me, and I am proud of the great work that he does for the church. Now, to our topic this afternoon, the title of the talk is Chastity Part of the Good News? Yes. Thank you very much. I think you expect a little bit more than that. So, to begin, what I'd like to do is propose to you what could be considered a 2-word summary of much of the preaching of Christ, much of the preaching of the kingdom of God. And it's not a 2-word summary that you're going to find in the gospel, strictly speaking. And in doing this, it's a little bit of a device, I think you could see. It has its limits because the incarnation is clearly something that is rich and complex and not easily reduced to just a few syllables. But I think there is some help for us in being practical and having a sure peg that we can return to from time to time as we consider how we are doing as disciples, or as we consider how we are thinking, or what our standard is for a successful and good life. So those 2 words are aim higher. The goods, by which I mean not only things, but experiences and relationships and even people. The goods of this world are indeed good because they come from God. And they are tokens of His love for us as His children. They are wonderful gifts and signs of His presence, the vestigia as Augustine called them, vestiges, the footprints of God in creation. But these goods are finite, and they are limited. Only God is infinite, and only God is eternal. But my desire, the desire of my heart and yours, is, in a sense, infinite, and my soul is, and your soul is, immortal. So, created things, as good as they are, cannot be for me or you what God can be and in fact is, and is to be. So we're not going to find Jesus using the words aim higher anywhere in the gospel, but he does urge us to lift our gaze from earth to heaven, from the immediate and the passing to the everlasting. And he urges us to think not only in human terms, but in terms of the divine. This is what St. Paul means when he says, put on the mind of Christ. Or, in that patristic formulation that's stunning, God became man so that man could become God. From the farewell discourse of John's Gospel, John 14, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you. And when I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you also may be. Higher. From the Good Shepherd Discourse, John 10, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And from the first Palm Sunday, Luke 19, would that even today you knew the things that make for peace. One of the 2 times that the Gospel records that Jesus wept. So pained was his heart that eyes and minds and hearts weren't set on higher things. C.S. Lewis was often an insightful student of the human condition. He said, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea, we are far too easily pleased. So, we do tend to settle easily, my brothers and sisters, and we have, or I should say I have anyway, I won't presume to know anything about you. I have abundant experience to verify what Lewis says. I have traded gold for bronze, and sometimes even baser metals. Now the great Cardinal Newman, and it's my opinion that one of the 3 most important things Pope Benedict did was beatify Cardinal Newman, and someday in the church we'll appreciate and understand the significance of that great man, Newman, for the modern church. Newman made a distinction between what he called notional assent and real assent. Notional assent being something that's an abstract idea, nevertheless attractive to us, but not yet instructive or determinative for how I'm living. Real assent means a principle that shapes my thinking and directs my conduct. So I believe in the resurrection of the body and life everlasting, the final words of the creed. But what does that look like in my life? This afternoon, tonight, tomorrow morning. Even the great St. Paul, who is my patron, admitted his efforts were sometimes misdirected. When he made that public confession in Romans, the good I want to do, I don't do. The evil that I want to avoid, that is what I do. So Christ tries to elevate our gaze above this horizon. He preached the Sermon on the Mount to show us the way to the fulfillment of our desires. He performed miracles to establish his identity as God, to build our confidence in him, and to lay the foundation of our understanding of the sacramental life, where divine power will now reside in what St. Paul called earthen vessels that will reside there through grace. Jesus healed the sick and infirm to draw us to his benevolence and to reassure us that he is the remedy for moral and spiritual weakness. And yet, what, dear friends, is the quality of our trust in the Lord, in his divine promises, all of which he has kept? He promised that he would rise from the dead, and he did. He promised that he would give us the bread from heaven, and he has, and he will later today for those of us at Mass. And he promised that he would not leave us orphans. Another divine promise. And then he asked us this question: O man of little faith, why did you doubt? Following the Master, St. Paul also urges us to look upward to live on a higher plane. He tells the Colossians, set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. And to the Corinthians, he says, but earnestly desire the higher gifts. And to the Corinthians again, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him. Dear friends, hold on to that idea and return to it frequently. We want to aim higher. If we aim higher, we will be happier. And I think that thought, aiming higher, living life on a higher plane, is something that bears particular relevance to what I hope to share with you this afternoon. And so to the particular topic. Is chastity part of the good news? In a conference on human ecology, I want to ensure at the start that I say, I understand that this is a human virtue, chastity, and so it's a virtue for all people. It's not just something unique or particular to Christians. And that I am going to approach it not just from a human standpoint, but from a Christian standpoint because, well, I would like to be a Christian, and I am a priest. So this is why I am taking this up in this frame and within the frame of our discussion. But why does a priest ask this question? Is chastity part of the good news? Does he have doubts? Does this have something to do with the recent and revived interest in married priesthood as an option, and not just for those who have become Catholic priests through the pastoral provision or the Anglican ordinary? Well, I assure you that I do not have doubts about the good of chastity, though that does not of itself make acquiring the virtue easier for me than for anyone else. And this talk is not about clerical celibacy. It really grows out of 20 years of priesthood and the various ministries and apostolates in which I have been blessed to serve. But look at it this way, and I won't ask for any audience participation. Suppose I called for a show of hands and I said, how many of you think that grace, mercy, and peace are part of the good news? A lot of hands are going to go up. And then I would ask you to put them down. And then I would say, how many of us think that chastity is part of the good news? And my experience when I have done that, to include in rooms full of priests, is that there's a hesitation. Grace, mercy, and peace are clearly for us. We love the story of the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan. But when we get to chastity, there's something within us that causes us to hesitate. And I know when I'm giving talks about chastity and clerical celibacy, especially to my brother priests, the room is especially quiet. It's one thing to talk about obedience. We all struggle with it. We all have our questions about our superiors and so on. And prayer, to which diocesan priests are pledged by virtue of their ordination, and other things that are aspects particular to priestly life. But when it gets to chastity, we have a particular and a personal interest that is, I think, unique and unlike the other virtues as we consider them. And in a way, that testifies to the marvelous and sacred power which chastity is directed to protect. here are three things of particular interest to me that lead me to this topic. The first is the cura animarum, the care of souls. 6 years of my priesthood was spent in a downtown parish in my diocese where we had confessions every day for at least an hour, to include on Sunday mornings. And it was a big parish, again in a downtown area, so I probably heard more confessions in that span than any of my brother priests in the diocese. I don't say that as a boast. It was simply a rich grace and experience. It taught me a lot about the human condition. And then I spent 9 years as the director of the church's principal ministry to men and women with same-sex attraction, called Courage. And in that time, I also learned a great deal about the human condition as it touches this question. I encountered hostility, especially to the church's teaching on homosexuality and therefore chastity, and I also encountered heroism on the part of those who live that teaching and carry this particular cross. Let me do a quick commercial. The film Desire of the Everlasting Hills. Has anybody seen it? Okay. Everlastinghills.org is the URL. You can watch it online. It takes an hour. It's a magnificent portrayal of the lives of three people who are encountering themselves in the grace, mercy, and peace of God as they endeavor to live chastity. I commend it to you. Everlastinghills.org. So though I am a teacher and sexual ethics is my particular field, and now I'm a full-time formator as rector of a seminary, college seminary, I've spent most of my priesthood thus far on the front lines, which is of course where Marines want to be, right? And so I understand the image that Pope Francis proposed for the church at the beginning of his pontificate of the field hospital. Obviously the church is much more than that, of course, we know that, and so does he. And while there are more dangerous sins than failures in chastity, St. Thomas himself verifies that and says that unchastity is not the worst of the deadly sins, grave matter though it is. My opinion would be that we have a plague, a blight, that we have visited on ourselves because of promiscuity, of ignoring both the truth of our human nature and the exhortations of Christ in the gospel. Please come in. Abortion, pornography, sexually transmitted diseases, out-of-wedlock pregnancies and births, marital infidelity, broken marriages, human trafficking, sexual abuse, Obergefell. No need to continue this tragic litany. And one consequence of the sexual revolution we might not think about often, that I've encountered, you may see it elsewhere, is loneliness. I gave a talk a couple of years ago to the St. Thomas More Society in Orange, California, Orange County, California. It's a number of lawyers, and there was one poor young man there, undoubtedly dragged there by his father to hear me talk about chastity. So afterwards, the young man came up to me and said, "Father, I didn't understand most of what you were talking about, but you did say one thing that caught my attention. I agree with you about loneliness. That defines a lot of my generation." Let's say he was in his early 20s. Paradoxically, because of the efficacy and availability of chemical contraception, we may have more physical intimacy than at any time in human history. But physical intimacy, of course, does not necessarily indicate moral or spiritual intimacy, as we know, let alone a sacramental character. So that's one of the plagues that we're dealing with, in addition to all the others. And another plague that I would put alongside this is the plague of regret. Confession heals the wounds of sin, thanks be to God, but it does not unmake the past. Regret may be the most bitter feeling that we have in this life. And in the sexual realm, I have observed that enough to know how powerful and painful it can be. So I have a strong pastoral interest in easing suffering and preventing it, redeeming it, particularly in this aspect of the human endeavor. People wonder what priests know and understand about sex. The truth is we know a lot, both good and bad, that we've learned from you, often in the confessional and in pastoral counseling. And so we're eager to share what we have learned with those who are willing to listen. Secondly, I am now entrusted with forming the next generation of priests in my diocese. It's a marvelous task, but a daunting one for many reasons, including for reasons that fall under the rubric of our gathering here this weekend, human ecology. Like others, one of my principal concerns is that culturally, and sometimes even ecclesiastically, we suffer from amnesia, from a loss of memory, by which I mean a memory of what it means to be human and to live in an authentically human way. We don't know our story, and so we don't know who we are. Like my brother Chris, I studied at Rice University, and I was a history major there. So I know about the value of that discipline when it is taught without cant or propaganda. And I want my seminarians to know history. Church history and salvation history, to be sure, but also world history. And yet, that will not teach them everything they need to know to answer these three critical questions. Who am I? What am I? And why am I? For these, we also need good literature, as well as the catechism. We need human and Christian anthropology, and we need philosophy. I like to remind the men under my care, agere seguitur esse. We're our metaphysicians. Action follows being, or with care, if I can translate it this way, identity. I can only know what to do with this if I first know what it is. First, I have to know these are glasses, and that they go on my face in that way. If that's true for these sorts of objects, it's also true for this. I have to know what it means to be human, and then I will know how to live. That means purpose, or its teleology, its end, fulfillment, and of course its limits. And then I can match my intention with what is in the thing. If I use this as a hammer, it's not going to work very well, even if it's my intention to use it as a hammer, because I think that's what it would be good for. It will only do what it's supposed to do if I harmonize what's in here with, in a sense, what's in here. Then I won't hurt myself or the thing or perhaps someone else. So if you come to St. John Fisher Seminary in Connecticut, and you're welcome, you will hear that metaphysics is the most pastoral of the philosophical sciences, followed by epistemology. And then we'll get to ethics. And I'm a moral theologian, I'm a moralist, so I know where my place is. I come later, last. Bishop Conley spoke last night about how the younger generations have never known a time without the internet and social media. They have also never known a time without the cultural norms for the when, where, how, and with whom of sexual expression as we have them today. And just as an aside, and I am at the end of the baby boom, born in 1959, I'm not so sure that things were better in 1950 in the sense of the virtue of chastity. I just think there were more restraints, to be sure, but so there was more continence. St. Thomas calls continence an imperfect virtue. It means not entering into that realm, but we don't know why. Is it because we're afraid? We have a broken heart, there's no one available, I'm not interested? Continence means, in effect, what we're not doing, or think abstinence. That's not quite the same as what chastity is. But anyway, that's just a side comment. Why did things come unravel so quickly? If we really, as a culture, lived the virtue of chastity prior to, let's say, the sexual revolution. Now, my point here is to say that the men studying for the priesthood have grown up and in some measure been influenced by their surroundings and in ways they may not realize. So we need to recover what they may not know they have lost. And that is part of the work of formation meant for the priesthood. So the third and final reason for my interest has to do with catechesis and evangelization. Switching back to our epistemology, where's my friend Dr. Cutback? Quid recipitur ad modum recipientis, right? What is received according to the mode of the receiver. So the coffee cup shapes your coffee when it's poured into it. We need more than good pedagogy or finding the right idiom to engage people. A dramatic reading from the catechism or magisterial document is not going to prove sufficient. In daytime prayer today in the breviary, we have from these words from Jeremiah, some of my favorite words from the Old Testament. What is more torturous than the human heart? Who can understand it? He's lamenting that. And fortunately, those words are not the last words, but they are something to acknowledge. Hearts are not won typically by syllogisms and theological formulas, though both have their place. But Jesus, whose Sacred Heart is the last word, and whose Sacred Heart is the answer to the tangle of my own heart, Jesus never lost an argument. But that was not his goal. His goal was not to lose hearts, and indeed his goal was to win them for the kingdom. I've been thinking recently just how difficult it is to change the human heart. Even the Son of Man met with, and continues to meet with what appears to be anyway, partial success in changing our hearts. Thank God our Mother the Church gives us Lent every liturgical year to address the question, how much territory of my heart is not yet won for the kingdom? When we pray the Our Father, thy kingdom come, it first applies here. How much of this kingdom, how much of this territory is not yet won? And I know, again at 58 years old, that there's much that is yet to be converted. And why? Not because I don't know what's right, but because I find it hard to change. Or better, I get fatigued in my efforts, and so I give up. My first opponent is not the evil one, though I don't want to underestimate him. No, it is the old man, the natural man, or the unregenerate man, as St. Paul calls him. He is stubborn and formidable in his resistance to the growth of all virtue, not just the one we're thinking about now. So here's my point. I will only be an effective instrument of grace for evangelization and catechesis, which the gospel enjoins on me. We're not the Catholic Amish, as my brother said last night. I will only be an effective instrument to the degree that I have surrendered to the good God and allowed him to order the desires of my heart, my mind, my day, and my life. Paul VI said the world needs teachers, yes, but it responds best to teachers who are witnesses. Now for myself, I think we're on a rescue mission. I have little optimism for rescuing the culture, but I have abundant hope for rescuing individual souls because I've seen it happen. And maybe it's because I'm a former Marine that I'm drawn so much to the church. The image of the church is the bark of Peter. And don't forget that Noah's Ark prefigures the story of Christ and the boat with the apostles. And the anchor is the symbol of hope. So I want to throw as many lifelines as possible. People often ask me, especially in my last assignment, encourage, tell me, pastoral care, how do I do it? What do I say? Give me the script. How do I approach this question? What do I say and do? Those were well-motivated and well-intentioned questions. But my answer was always the same. First, we have to deepen our own conviction and understanding of what the church teaches is true, and our conviction that it leads to fulfillment. Secondly, we have to look at our own probity and integrity of life, how we're living. And then we will be ready to serve and lead. We don't want to underestimate the challenge of changing hearts, nor do we want to underestimate the power of grace when we cooperate with it. Now, if you forget everything else I've said today, except the part about the Marines guarding the streets of heaven, remember that. If you forget everything else that I've said today, and will say in the next part of this talk, please remember this. Jesus Christ lived an intensely happy and fulfilled human life. That might not something that might again be something that we don't think about a lot, because the crucifix is the central symbol of Christianity, as it should be. But Jesus' life was intensely happy and fulfilled because of his life of self-giving, which was perfect, and that self-giving love reached its highest expression at Calvary. So how can I make this claim, that our Lord's life was intensely happy and fulfilled? Well, because he made the claim himself. From the farewell discourse, John 15, these things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and your joy may be full. Remember my brother last night said, Nemo dat quod non habet. We can't give what we don't have. Christ can only give what he already possesses in his humanity. He is the perfection of all things human. He has come to restore the lost joy of the children of God. Where did our first parents live? In paradise. And where was Jesus' heart? Where was his treasure? Well, it was in heaven with his Father. For where your treasure is, there your heart be also. Don't we say, store up treasure in heaven? So, Jesus Christ lived an intensely happy and fulfilled human life. These things I have spoken to you, he said, that my joy may be in you and your joy may be full. What are these things? My mother, Chris's mother, is an English teacher. So at the dining or the kitchen table at night, we had very good questions, very good conversations about books we read and so on and so on. But we learned words like antecedent, probably when we were in the second grade. What is an antecedent? Well, it's something that goes before. So our Lord says, I have told you these things. What things? What's gone before? Here's the verse immediately preceding. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have told you these things, that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. So it would seem as though there are three things that are intimately connected together in the mind of God-man. Love, joy, and the commandments. Now, we were doing pretty good with the first two, right? Everybody wants love. Everybody wants joy. What about the commandments? So let's think about this in another way. Let's think about the moral life in another way, in a way that St. Thomas thought about it when he gave us the second part of the Summa. Because when St. Thomas thinks about the commandments, he doesn't ignore them, of course. He thinks in other terms. He thinks in terms of virtue. So we can actually go through the commandments and assign a virtue to each one of them. You will love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength, and not have strange gods before him. That's the virtue of fidelity. Or if you like, the virtue of spiritual childhood. Didn't our Lord say you can't enter the kingdom of heaven except that you become like little children? The virtue of the second commandment, either do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, or love one another as I have loved you, is the virtue of reverence. Reverence for the name of another, reverence for the person of the other. The third commandment is the virtue of service. What's the most important service that we provide to God, that we do for him? We worship him in the way in which he asked us, which for Catholics means at Mass, the Holy Mass. The fourth commandment is the virtue of pietas. We translate that in English as piety. Piety, we often think of Eucharistic piety or Marian piety. Those are fine, but that's not what pietas is. That's a reverence, honor, devotion, respect for those who have some kind of authority over us in the family, in civil society, in the church. Fifth commandment, we'll call the virtue of meekness. The sixth commandment, the virtue of chastity. We'll come back to that. The seventh commandment is the virtue of justice. Eighth commandment is the virtue of truthfulness or veracity. Ninth commandment, purity of heart. 10th commandment, let's call it temperance. Virtues. Virtues. When I'm talking with young people, what I like to do is ask them, tell me somebody you admire. Whom do you admire and why? Once we get the names of the popular and the beautiful and the rich and the successful people out of the way, we get down to character types, you know who they admire. People who are generous, self-forgetful, kind, considerate, humble, self-giving. Why do they admire those people? Because those are virtues. Virtues are things for which we are made. A virtue is the path and the power to what is noble, what is fulfilling in a deep and lasting sense. That for which we are made, what we admire, what we would like to see in ourselves. When I was a young Marine officer, one of my duty stations, the CO had been a young trooper in the Vietnam War, and one night in combat, the enemy soldiers had thrown a hand grenade into the position where he was with his buddies, and he dove on it. Now, it turned out that the grenade was a dud. It didn't go off, thank God. But that didn't lessen his act of heroism, because he had no idea. He was written up for the Medal of Honor. He received the Navy Cross, which is one step down. He wore it on his uniform. He never talked about it. But every Marine in the command knew what Major Ron Helly had done. It captured their imagination, and they wondered, could I, would I, in a case like that? Those virtues, those things that we see in other people that we're drawn to, we're attracted to them. And what are those virtues? They're powers. They're powers for human excellence and for human flourishing, both in nature and in grace. Do you remember the episode in the gospel where the woman comes up behind Jesus and touches the cloak, the tassel of the cloak, and the translation today says, and Jesus felt the power go out of him? If you look in the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation, the Latin compendium that St. Jerome gives us, that word that's translated into power in English, in the modern translation, the word he uses there is virtus, or I think virtutum in the accusative. In the older translations, like King James or the Douay Rheims, it says, and Jesus felt the virtue go out of him. Now that sounds odd to our ears, doesn't it? Like you're losing virtue, but that's not what it means. He doesn't lose its virtue. The point is that virtue is that power for healthy, vital living in a moral or spiritual sense. And Christ shares that power with us. We're interested in those powers. We're attracted to those powers. Here's what the Catechism calls a virtue: a habitual and firm disposition to do the good. It allows the person not just to perform good acts, but to give the best of himself. The virtuous person tends toward the good with all his sensory and spiritual powers. He pursues the good and chooses it in concrete actions. The goal of a virtuous life, says St. Gregory of Nyssa, is to become like God. God became man so that man could become God. The cardinal virtues, the moral and intellectual virtues specify our humanity. What does it mean to be human? To be prudent, to be just, to be courageous, and to be temperate. Prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. That's our humanity. What's our Christianity? Faith, hope, and charity. Those are the identity of the human and the Christian. So in Christ's mind here, going back to the commandments, what he said, I have told you these things that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. I've kept the commandments, now you keep the commandments. Joy, love, and virtue all go together for him. And we know that moral decision-making does have something to do with happiness. Even if we take it out of the realm of chastity for a moment, we know that it's satisfying to tell the truth even when it's hard. And we know that there's a connection to those forms of human life or Christian life. So there's moral decision-making. There's the satisfaction we feel in a good way, not in a selfish way, from doing what's right. And then there's a connection to the design that clarifies and marks out, establishes the path to fulfillment. We call that our human nature at the level of nature. We call it our Christianity at the level of grace. And those things are what transcend us and unify us. We couldn't establish a community except that there are things that are common to all of us particulars. We're back to our metaphysics. Prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, faith, hope, charity. Now, Jesus Christ embodied all the virtues perfectly. And he was poor, chaste, and obedient. We call those the evangelical counsels: poverty, chastity, and obedience. They are, if you like, the forms of self-giving. They are what lead to the perfection of charity. Those counsels, the evangelical counsels, like the virtues, lead to the fulfillment of human nature and its perfection because they lead to self-giving. So remember a moment ago I said, if you forget everything else I say, remember that Jesus Christ lived an intensely happy human life. Here's part 2. Jesus Christ lived a perfectly happy, intensely human life, not in spite of his poverty, chastity, obedience, but because of them. Let me repeat that. Christ lived an intensely happy and fulfilled human life because he was poor, chaste, and obedient. And he proposes those evangelical counsels to us, the Catechism says, in their great variety to every disciple. We tend to associate them with religious life because the religious make those vows. That's fine. But as disciples of Christ, we are to enflesh, according to our state in life, the way that he lived his life. The summary of the Christian life, I think St. Paul gives us so magnificently in Galatians 2:20. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And those virtues that we are trying to live and that we are trying to stir up the gifts of the Holy Spirit through bring about what St. Paul is urging. So charity is self-giving. It is the highest form of love, agape in the Greek. And God is love, as St. John tells us, and God is perfectly content in himself. So there are connections here for us to see if we are living on a higher plane, if we are aiming higher. Now let me say that if we live on that higher plane, it doesn't mean we disdain the things of the world. In fact, we actually appreciate them more because they don't have a hold on us. And we can enjoy them in the way that God intends us to enjoy. Let's think about our Lord's first miracle. He produced the best Cabernet, or was it Brunello? I don't remember, that the world has ever seen. And the psalmist tells us about taking some wine and what its effects are. And St. Paul tells his spiritual son, St. Timothy, to stop drinking only water and drink a little bit of wine. But when those things don't have a hold on us, we actually can appreciate them and enjoy them more. So it doesn't mean that we disdain things. We're not Puritans. We're Christians. Here's what the Catechism calls chastity: the successful integration of sexuality within the person, and thus the inner unity of man in his bodily and spiritual being. Integration. Now that appetite for sexual congress is at the service of prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, faith, hope, and charity. Strictly speaking, chastity is a subset of the virtue of temperance with regard to the sexual appetite, but as Thomas points out, it also bears witness to the virtue of justice, rendering someone else their due. And under the rubric of love one another as I have loved you, it touches the virtue of reverence as well. Love one another as I have loved you. That's the next verse in John 5, after I have told you these things, that my joy may be in you, and your joy may be complete. It's all woven together in one fabric. When we read the gospel, we see that our Lord only raises the bar with regard to chastity in his teaching on marriage, purity of heart, and celibacy for the kingdom. Some people think that Jesus didn't say anything about contraception or homosexuality, and therefore there are no prescriptions against them. Well, he doesn't have to use the words directly because he is addressing the underlying enemies of chastity. The two great ones are divorce and lust. And by addressing those things, he addresses everything else that you'll find in the Sixth Commandment in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. He only raises the bar when he starts to talk about the Sixth Commandment. That's important for us. He wants us to aim higher, which means that chastity must be something more than simple continence, avoiding doing something. It's integrating that appetite into our identity as marked out by the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues. Now, the enemies of this are obvious. Let me just say a word about contraception, since this is the 50th anniversary of Humanity Day. Contraception impedes self-giving and spousal love. And self-giving is the path to that rich fulfillment of the heart that Christ lived. So anything that gets in the way of self-giving, all selfishness, all of the vices, All of the 7 deadly sins get in the way of self-giving. But contraception gets in the way particularly with regard to spousal love. Now, of course, I'm presuming that we all know that it should not be used outside of marriage because sexual congress, conjugal love, is something that is proper to the sacramental bond or to a natural bond as the church recognizes it for those who enter into it in the proper circumstances. Sometimes people say that contraception deliberately separates the unitive from the procreative. I think that language is imprecise, and I wouldn't recommend it. The problem with contraception is it drives a wedge deliberately between sex and babies, between sex and fertility. And those babies, of course, are an expression of the self-giving love of the spouses. So my point here is to say that the problem with contraception is it attacks marital chastity, both in the sense of getting in the way of a pregnancy, but also getting in the way of that union of mind, heart, souls, and bodies that both Genesis and St. Paul in Ephesians refer to, that the two become one flesh. Because it's not just the carnal union that sacred scripture is referring to there. Contraception damages both unitive and procreative. Let me also say, and I only have a few more comments so we finish on time here, the church doesn't oppose artificial contraception. Glasses are artificial. Pacemakers are artificial. Hearing aids are artificial. A hip, if you have one, or a knee that's been replaced is artificial. The church doesn't oppose any of those things. Getting on the airplane tomorrow morning at 30,000 feet to fly home to New York for me is artificial because I don't have any wings. So even though Paul VI used the word artificial 4 times in Humanae Vitae, I think if it were rewritten today, the word would come out. My mother, the English teacher, says the adjective weakens the noun. And here it confuses things. Because sometimes people think, well, as long as it's natural in this sphere, it must be okay. Well, we know there's something to qualify that because the intention of the spouses with regard to why they're not having a child is something that bears on the moral quality of the act. I want another big boat, I want another big house, I don't want any more children, I have my boy and my girl, that kind of thing. So, I think it's better to think here in terms of what contraception really is. It deliberately attempts, metaphysically it can't do it in terms of change of being, but it deliberately attempts to drive this wedge between sex and fertility and therefore damages self-giving love. Why am I speaking about this? Well, it's obviously a sin against chastity. But go back to what I said earlier about probity of life and integrity of life. We want our young people to live chaste lives, but we have to model that for them. And that is something that at this stage of my life, I appreciate much better than I did when I would have been a young boy in that school that Patrick was talking about. And boy, I wish I could have gone to school like that. It's not just what we're not doing, it's what we are doing that leads to fulfillment. Let me finish with something I found in a pamphlet years ago that I think is very helpful here. It's called 7 Locks to Guarding Your Heart. Because we always want practical advice when it comes to something, learning a virtue, in this case purity. And when you hear lock, I don't want you to think shutting things out. That's not the point. The point is to say, let's preserve and promote and foster what's there to make it more alive and vital and good and pure. This is St. Thomas's moral theology. He's not saying that we should go head to head like this against the vices. What he says is crowd out the bad with the good. Push it off stage. When a man and woman get married, on the day of their marriage, if you said to them, can you ever imagine being unfaithful to your spouse? They would laugh and say, that's impossible. Because at that moment, their minds and hearts are so filled, as they should be, so full with love for the other person. There's no room for anything else together, right? Okay. The first lock here is we should avoid losing the love that God has put into the heart. The heart is made to love, and if that love that God has given to us is not nurtured and fulfilled in a good way, the desire for love is not going to go away. But we could fulfill it in a bad way. So the way to avoid falling in love in the wrong way is to avoid falling out of love with the right person, which for all of us is God. You know, St. Augustine says we're all feminine with respect to God, Latin, an inflected language, anima, the soul is feminine. God's the initiator. We are to be the active recipient. And love is not something which is effortless, of course. And so we can think about our need for, in nature and grace, different ways to foster that love, things that are obvious enough to you. But love is to be growing and increasing all the time, both in quality and intensity. So that's the first one. God has put a love into our heart. And at baptism, that grace of the Holy Spirit was given to us. God, who is love, who is charity, came to dwell here. So the sacramental life is indispensable. Do you know that Mother Teresa used to go to confession at least once a week? All of her beautiful nuns, the missionaries of charity, they go to confession once a week. When I tell people that, they say, well, what in the world would Mother Teresa have to go to confession for? I've never heard Mother Teresa's confession, so I wouldn't answer that question for her. But the reason she became the saint that we know her to be was because the love of God fired her heart. And that is not to be true just for religious or priests, of course, it's for all disciples. And that is fostered in a number of ways, but especially through the sacramental life. So that's first. Number two, we have to guard the senses, especially the sense of sight and touch. And I would say hearing as well. This has really changed everything. Now here's what I can tell you about hearing confessions of children in middle school without violating the seal. Anybody who has a smartphone is one click away from trouble. And parents, I urge you, if your children have those devices, please take what steps are necessary to ensure that they're using them properly. There are all kinds of ways to do that. But what I do know from hearing confessions of middle school children is they're becoming involved in things that are called by misnomer, a terrible name, adult entertainment. It's not entertainment for anyone. But this has really changed things. It's made it so much more difficult than the static images that we used to have in certain magazines. So, guarding the senses. Don't we say the eyes are the window to the soul? When those images are burned into the imagination. Patrick, what are you talking about healing the imagination? This is something that is vital today and more difficult because of, here I am, your counterexample, giving my talk off the screen. Shame on you, Father. Number three, we need to maintain actual physical distance from circumstances where we could get into trouble. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about spousal love or conjugal love, am I? And there are clearly things that are a little bit outside the sphere of my talk that would need to be addressed. And here, I did speak about contraception. But we need to watch for those hidden motives to accidentally bump into someone because of the desire for physical closeness. Now, of course, when two people are falling in love, this can be fine. This can be very good. It can be something very healthy and wholesome and something to be encouraged. But in other circumstances, and not just for priests and religious, it might not be. So if someone is starting to stand out in my mind from the crowd, become central in my thoughts, I need to ask myself the question, why is that? Now, it could, again, be something very good for two unmarried people who are starting to get to know each other and fall in love, fine. And even there, of course, chastity still applies. A question the priests are sometimes asked is, how far can I go? That's already a bad question. It's already a bad question. Number three was maintaining physical distance. Number four is we have to check the moral or emotional distance. We have to take care with who we are confiding matters of the heart to. Because there are some people who have no right to hear them. There are concentric circles of relationships, right? And the people out here don't know what the people in here are supposed to know. Even the culture pushes back on this. What do the initials TMI mean? Too much information. So there are things that we can say to people in here that don't belong out there. We need to ask ourselves, am I maintaining that moral, emotional distance that's proper? 5, watch the way we reveal our feelings. Are we given to emotionalism, to sentimentality, to drama? Is there a neediness? These things work against purity of heart. Number 6, take care not to revisit dangerous memories. Controlling the imagination is a demanding and difficult work, but it is possible. And 7th and finally, we have to close the door to all useless dreams and flights of fancy. Really, that's egoism. Because sanctity, holiness of life, a virtuous life, a Christ-like life depends on the way that I am living right now, here, my state in life today. I have to live in the what is, not in the what if. That will help me to live a good and holy life. These are just some practical things, friends, for not only guarding the good love, but fostering it and building it. Chastity is part of the good news because it is freedom. Like all of the virtues, it's directed to the freedom of the children of God. Not in a licentious or licensed way or self-indulgence way, but directed towards that self-gift, which reached its maximum expression at Calvary, where Christ lived a perfectly fulfilled and happy human life. Thank you.